So we hear about the SPG all the time, and there are a few phenomenal facts that you might want to sort of retain if you say to other people that you got to hear this wonderful lecture. But basically, he's a 19th century Quaker minister. He was born in 1802 in upstate New York, and he lived 91 years and died in a slightly different part of upstate New York. And during his life, he traveled broadly and spoke many, many times. In the biographical material I've read, he apparently said he gave over 3,000 funeral sermons. In addition, he gave over 2,200 regular sermons. He doesn't use the word regular, but that's listed in a different place. And his life started on a farm, and I loved hearing last night when Elder Rick Lightning spoke about the life in Iraq. Apparently his practice as a young man on his father's farm was to pause and pray for guidance at a huge rock on one end of his father's fields. So he obviously knew something about the rocks. He had an apparently stentorian voice, and people could hear him speaking in an open air space at a great distance, and people would come from miles around when they heard he was going to speak. And even when he died, it was bitterly cold weather, and over 1,000 people turned up for his funeral, which was preached with a verse from the Bible that he'd asked his friend to cite, and I have to quote that to you. So he asked to have his friend Wilson, Isaac Wilson from Bloomfield in Canada, read from Mark 37. "Mark the perfect man and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace." So this was the person on whom our lecture series has been founded, Sunderland P. Gardner.
My name is Nathalie Brunet. I am clerk of program committee, and as such it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Maggie Knight tonight. Maggie grew up on unceded Coast Salish territory in Victoria, BC. She's a member of Vancouver Island Monthly Meeting and has sojourned with meetings in Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver. She's a third-generation Quaker of British extraction, and she became involved with Friends after attending Camp Niconis in her early teens. She's worked on restorative justice and Indigenous rights with Canadian Friends Service Committee, and recently served as clerk of Canadian Young Friends Yearly Meeting and the working group, the CYM working group, determining priorities and envisioning changes. A social and climate justice activist since her teens, Maggie studied environment and economics at McGill University and served as president of McGill's undergraduate student union during the tumultuous 2011-2012 Quebec student strike. She was the first managing director of the progressive political nonprofit organization leadnow.ca, where she built a distributed national campaigning organization while navigating the joys of 4 time zones and 17 staff person calls via Google Hangouts, and program committee is challenged to measure up to that. Now, at 27, she works as the BC Civil Liberties Association's new operations manager. And in 2015, she married her longtime partner, Nat Egan Pimblett, now Nat Knight, under the care of Vancouver Island Monthly Meeting. And they live in Vancouver with their very talkative cat.
Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge and give thanks for standing today on Treaty 6 territory, traditional territory of the Cree and Métis. Thank you to all these friends for their kind words, and to everyone who has held me in the light as I have prepared my words for you tonight. It's a pleasure to be back in this room. Despite growing up in the West, this is only my second time attending CYM in Camrose. I guess that's what happens when you move out east for 7 years. The last time I was in Camrose, I was 16. The last time I was in this room, before this week, I was groggy from staying up all night with other young friends, trying to stay awake to help read the young friend epistle. I sat at the back with a boy I'd met a few days before and hoped, we had shared a breath-catching moment when we clasped hands at the close of meeting. A boy with a ponytail, a boy who became the man I'm delighted to call my husband. Naz in the row in the front here, if you'd like to make him feel embarrassed now. That was 11 years ago. So not all that long in Quaker time, but quite a long time in the world and quite a long time for me. 11 years ago, it was 2005, and I didn't have a cell phone or a Facebook account or my own computer. YouTube was a few months old, and Twitter wouldn't exist for another year. I had one email account, an embarrassing Hotmail address. It would be another 18 months before the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its monumental fourth report that helped to convince the public that climate change is real and urgent. It would be 4 years until hopes for a fair, ambitious, legally binding United Nations climate deal were dashed in Copenhagen, and 5 years until I traveled with the Canadian youth delegation to the following year's UN climate talks in Cancun, Mexico, to try to pick up the pieces. In 2005, I knew about residential schools, but it would be 2 years before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples would be adopted, and 8 more years before Canada agreed to honor it. It would be 7 years before Idle No More took to the streets, and 8 years before I traveled to Elsipogtog, New Brunswick to bear witness days after RCMP attacked First Nations-led defenders of the land and water. In 2005, I'd been to my first couple of rallies with my friends, one in support of striking BC teachers, and one celebrating the legalization of same-sex marriage. I was part of my high school's Gay-Straight Alliance, and I'd never had a conversation about trans rights. I was proud to call myself a feminist, but the consent I understood was still no means no, not yes means yes. In 2005, the attacks of 9/11 were only 4 years in the past, and my understanding of police brutality was academic and probably based on something I'd read by Noam Chomsky or Naomi Klein. It would be 5 years before I stayed up late into the night, flipping between the news, Twitter, and Facebook, doing media monitoring duty in Montreal, while friends I loved were kettled in the rain and detained en masse during the Toronto G20. In 2005, I was about to start grade 11, and I didn't know yet that I'd make the grade and garner the scholarships I needed to go to McGill University. I didn't know that I'd end up running for president of the McGill Undergraduate Student Society, or that I'd win, or that my term would include a campus labor strike, riot cops pepper-spraying students on campus, and the 2012 Quebec student strike, more commonly known outside the province as the Maple Spring. In 2005, I had just been nominated to serve on my first Quaker committee, Canadian Young Friends yearly meeting rep to Camp Nokonis, in case you were wondering. There have been a few more committees since then. In 2005, I was 16 and in the first flush of falling in love with a Quaker boy with a ponytail. So why have I taken you on this meander down a decade of my memory lane? Because tonight I want to talk about change. I want to talk about continuing revelation and about the things I've learned about myself in the last 11 years. I want to talk about how we can transform to meet the challenges of this decade and this century. This spring, I was lucky enough to visit some old Quaker writings at the University of Toronto's Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. I am no religious scholar, but I love delicately leafing through their musty pages, looking for early Quaker writings on continuing revelation. William Penn's 1694 tome entitled A Brief Account of the Rise and Progress of the People Called Quakers comes with a wonderful title page summary in which their fundamental principle, doctrines, worship, ministry, and discipline are plainly declared to prevent the mistakes and perversions that ignorance and prejudice may make to abuse the credulous. I chuckled at this focus on making ourselves understood despite confusion in wider society. While no longer the target of religious persecution, at least in Canada, Friends are again in a time where we often struggle to explain our ways. As a young friend, I found it hard to listen in tongues, to hear the meaning behind the words, and to overcome my resistance to theistic language. In her 1988 SPG lecture, Betty Polster said, "God promises to send you the messages you need, but doesn't promise to send them in words you like. When all else fails, then let the message flow over you like water off a duck's back." In her 2005 SPG lecture, Helen Rowlands discussed continuing revelation, saying of George Fox, quote, "We know Fox was so steeped in knowledge of the Bible that it was simply a given in his worldview. His language is full of biblical imagery and references, sometimes lost on us today. In our modern era, along with the truths of the Christian inheritance, we encounter daily truths of other faiths, emerging out of other cultures and other worldviews. We in turn read them through our own paradigm, as Fox did through his," unquote. I still struggle to find the right language to answer the question, do you believe in God? For me, the existence of God is not the focus. My faith and practice is not contingent on the existence of a mystical divine presence or being, although it is based in a seeking for a deeper spiritual wisdom that comes from places I do not understand and which some might call God. I know that the words we use matter, even as we endeavor to listen in tongues. Tonight I will reference some theistic writings and speak from my own experience in the language that speaks most plainly from my heart. I hope you will listen to the meaning behind the words and translate into your own spiritual diction to suit your need. And so, what do we mean when we talk about continuing revelation? It is the commitment to ongoing discernment, to the belief that the divine will continue to unfold its wisdom to us if we listen, that our faith is an ongoing practice and journey. It is the belief that our faith continues to evolve rather than stemming from a static religious text. It allows us to embrace and lead social change in our time beyond what Fox and Penn and Fell could have imagined. This belief in continuing revelation is the reason that I'm a Quaker. It's the reason I love meeting for Worship for Business. It's the reason I believe that Quakers can continue to be a force for good in the world, both individually and collectively, for many centuries to come. It is also at the heart of my belief that we must come to our spiritual practice and to our CYM business with a sense of hope, adventure, and abundance, rather than a fear of change or a fear of scarcity. I have learned a great deal since I was last in this room 11 years ago, and trust that I will learn a great deal more in the years to come. Many people in this room have been part of my journey, and I'm sure some of you could tell me what learnings I might find just around the corner. I hope tonight's collection of thoughts may have something for all of you, even if only revisiting things that you already know and teach. Something I am coming to peace with is that there are some lessons I need to learn over and over again. Tonight I will endeavor to speak from my own experience and discernment, as is the Quaker way. I will share some of my messes, along with some of successes. I have divided my thoughts into 3 sections: transforming ourselves, transforming our religious society of friends, and transforming our world. There will also be stretch breaks in between these sections. So, part 1, transforming ourselves. Pennsylvanian-born friend Howard Brinton wrote in 1948, "As long as there is inward chaos, all outward actions will be contaminated by this chaos. In such a case, all that we do will promote rather than allay confusion. We seek to bring peace in the world when there is no peace in our hearts, and as a result, we infect the outer world with our inner conflict." In May 2015, I found myself sitting in a counselor's office for the first time since high school. It was 2 months before my wedding, and the emotional complexities of navigating family dynamics in conjunction with a hefty set of logistical arrangements had overcome any lingering fears about the stigma of admitting that some kindly professional help might be in order. I quipped to the counselor, "I only abuse myself in ways society approves of," and then paused, realizing how true this is. My story is a fairly common one in this age. I jokingly sum it up as, "Hello, my name is Maggie, and I'm a workaholic." I've been perfecting the craft of workaholism since my early teens. At 16, I was successfully walking a tightrope of success. Top of the class student, competitive athlete, avid activist, and volunteer. I was enjoying it and the adrenaline of busyness that came with it. As I walked this tightrope, I wasn't terrified of the fall, but I hadn't yet learned to question whether walking the tightrope was actually what I was called to do. In the decades since high school, I've experienced activist burnout, learned where in my body my stress lives, and made the mistake of being so over-responsible for projects, organizations, and colleagues' well-being that I become reactive and defensive. Much to my husband's relief, I finally admitted to myself that when I'm so stressed and busy that I can't eat breakfast without throwing up, something needs to change. And now I actually know how to make that change happen. I've learned a lot about the importance of accepting and loving myself while also challenging myself to grow. We all need to give attention to healing ourselves as part of quelling that inner chaos. I have learned from watching many friends who live out their lives at a more reasonable pace, who live out their witness in part by ensuring enough time for healing and reflection. I also trust that I am not the only friend in this room who struggles with being overbusy or being pulled in too many directions. While sometimes hardship gives us little choice, I think we have more agency in determining our commitment load than we usually think. Texan sociologist Brené Brown has studied vulnerability and shame for decades. Her words build on Howard Brinton's about the need to attend to inner chaos. Brown writes, "Generosity cannot exist without boundaries. Nothing is sustainable without boundaries." Her guiding query is, what boundaries need be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you? This also goes with the acronym BIG, in case you need to keep that in your back pocket. As Betty Polster said in her SPG, we not only let fear of change keep us from spiritual growth, many of us also fail to allow time for growth and change because of our busyness. The personal is political, and the personal is spiritual. I have learned that taking care of ourselves so we are able to grow is a critical part of social change. When we protect our boundaries and steward our spiritual energy so that we may give generously of ourselves, we are able to live out our testimonies and be open to continuing revelation. In this way, we can avoid feeling threatened or getting stuck when we are confronted by social witness that requires us to change our own beliefs. The social change that I seek thrives on neither martyrdom nor blind pragmatism. Of course, the busyness of modern life is deeply cultural. For millennials experiencing economic instability, it can be a vicious cycle. We feel precarious, which leads to a belief that we must constantly be hustling, through side businesses, through part-time education on top of work, etc., just to stay in the same place. This increased pressure and busyness aggravates our sense of anxiety and eats up time that might otherwise have been spent grounding ourselves with reflection or worship, connecting with friends and family, and taking care of our bodies through good food, exercise, and sufficient rest. Indeed, sleep deprivation is now an epidemic across generations, as discussed at length in Arianna Huffington's recent book, The Sleep Revolution. Hugh Welkel, Executive Director of the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, writes, "Today we are taught by a culture that views work as an end in itself. It is what supplies our identity and gives meaning to our lives by maximizing success and money through our labor. Our work is never done, and the constant drive to prove ourselves destroys our ability to find rest. This distortion of work's purpose cripples our chances of finding true joy and fulfillment in our work. When divorced from God, all work degenerates into pure self-centered ambition." As I listen in tongues, to me this means that when my ambition isn't grounded in my values or seasoned through discernment, it becomes harmful to my psyche and my sense of self. It hurts me in my soul. I've found that the idea of surrendering to the Sabbath is remarkably helpful as I've sought to dial back my workaholism. Wayne Muller, author of Sabbath, Finding Rest, Renewal, and Delight in Our Busy Lives, writes, "Sabbath requires surrender. If we only stop when we are finished with all our work, we will never stop because our work is never completely done. With every accomplishment, there arises a new responsibility. Sabbath dissolves the artificial urgency of our days because it liberates us from the need to be finished." There are inherent limits on what each of us can achieve. Even if we way overextend ourselves, our productivity will never be infinite. What makes us choose to stretch ourselves to 120% of what we can sustain rather than seeking to stop at 80? What makes us push past the point at which we retain resilience to the shocks that life may send our way? The point where we give of ourselves freely, joyously, and without resentment. The point where we have the energy to take responsibility for our emotional triggers and the harm we may cause and need to reconcile. We need to discern carefully when we think about taking joy and leisure in life as an indulgence. The solution to the world's ills is not a race to the bottom. Each of us who is prone to overwork and overcommitment has our own patterns. Some of mine stem from a fear of economic insecurity and the teenage belief that only through being outstanding in multiple categories would I gain the scholarships I needed to attend the university I wanted, which in turn I believed would both give me the education my mind and curiosity craved and also armor me against future economic woes. These beliefs are both true and untrue. It is true that on the strength of scholarships and part-time jobs, I was able to complete my degree without going into debt, which gave me a level of agency and freedom experienced by few of my peers whose parents, like mine, didn't fund their university tuition. However, in the wake of the 2008 economic crash and the likelihood of future economic shocks due to climate change, I've come to believe that being part of a strong community is just as important a form of protection against the woes of the world as amassing wealth might be. In seeking to transform myself, I'm currently working with 3 queries that I'll share with you tonight. In fall 2014, guided by these queries and the acknowledgement that throwing up one's breakfast is not a healthy start to the day, I chose to step back from the role of managing director at political advocacy startup Lead Now. I had been there through an intense growth phase, starting as the 3rd full-time team member and managing the operations, human resources, and internal strategy as we grew to 17 staff in under 2 years. I had achieved the things I'd initially set out to achieve, and in looking ahead another year to the upcoming 2015 federal election, I just felt exhausted. I knew that I would not be able to lead during this intense electoral period with the skill and integrity I so value, and so decided it was time to put in place a succession plan. This decision would set in motion some incredibly important life lessons and spiritual growth. So the first query, what is enough? When I realized it was right for me to leave Lead Now, I had just moved back to BC after 2 years living in Halifax while Nat worked on his master's. We landed with Nat's mom, Meredith Egan, in the small city of Mission, an hour outside Vancouver, planning to stay for a couple of months while Nat looked for work. We were deeply grateful to have family to stay with while we readjusted to life in BC, a home base from which we could figure out how to find housing in Vancouver's overheated market. As the sole income earner at the time, quitting my job felt like jumping off a cliff. There we would be, 2 unemployed millennials living with my partner's mom in the suburban Fraser Valley, 9 months out from our mostly self-financed wedding. As a city kid without a driver's license who had been financially independent for 7 years, you can imagine how much I liked the sound of that. It flew in the face of all the advice I'd heard to quit before finding a new job, And yet I knew that if I wanted to lead according to my principles, now was the right time for the organization. Having calculated and recalculated that yes, we could indeed feed ourselves and still get married on the strength of my savings, even if neither of us earned a cent for 5 months, I took a lot of deep breaths and jumped off the cliff. And then the universe laughed at me. I gave my notice on Tuesday morning, applied to a position recommended by a mentor late that night, had an interview on Friday morning, and had signed a new contract by the following Tuesday. Okay, universe, I get it. I need to work on my fear of economic scarcity and live with a little more trust. I still have trouble thinking that this experience wasn't just a lucky fluke, kind of like all those times I didn't fail those tests. I am financially cautious by nature and from experience, and my inner skeptic finds it difficult to trust statements like, the universe will provide. But this experience helps me to explore the idea of enough and the idea of what constitutes safety. After we have sufficient food, shelter, and safety, what is enough? We all know others who have more or less than we do, and friends have often critiqued the consumerism that drives our economy and relies on a belief that we always need more. Yes, in a Vancouver real estate market, we will never have enough to buy a house, but we are miles more secure than most of our peers, at least at the moment. Knowing that my fear of economic precarity is one of the sources of my drive to be the best, I'm striving to discern the difference between leadings that are ego-fueled and those that are soul-called. The ego-fueled leadings can, I believe, sometimes be true leadings. One part of my ego drives me to do things that society tells me I can't do because I'm young or because I'm female. Or it gives me the courage to take risks, like running for student union president. I try to love this part of myself while discerning carefully the balance of ego to bravery. Soul-called leadings come from a different place, from listening to that still, quiet voice within, when I am suddenly wise to a way that I must be, or a thing I must do. They may be difficult to live out, but I rarely find them confusing or unclear if I have taken enough time to sit with them. They are what my soul knows to be true. Through discernment and an openness to the continuing revelation, I seek what the Serenity Prayer terms the wisdom to know the difference between these two sources of leadings. Today, enough for me is enough time and money to live healthily and nurture my community, to travel enough to maintain friendships across distances, to have enough buffer or cushion to fend off the most likely emergencies, and to contribute to the safety and happiness of my family and friends. Query 2. When do I most love myself? When am I in best balance with myself? Once I did the work of uncoupling my sense of self-worth from the volume of my accomplishments and productivity, I was left with a deeper understanding of when I most love myself, when my outer actions are most aligned with who I want to be. I am at my best when I conserve enough of my capacity to be generous, kind, and helpful to friends. At my worst, these kindnesses are part of some kind of tally, where I expect that the gift of my time will be recognized as extra valuable because I am such a busy and important person, and I expect a friendly kindness to be reciprocated. At my best, my time and efforts are given freely for the joy of giving, with no expectation of further return. When I'm at my most aligned, I have the energy to explore new things and meet new people. At my most overextended, I have no desire to meet new people, and I feel fragile and defensive when trying to explain who I am to new acquaintances. For much of my time at Lead Now, I was so intensely focused on the work of building a national political startup that I had little energy left to build community in our new home city, Halifax. I had some friends and acquaintances, but no one close enough, other than that, to stage an intervention if I hadn't stopped working for 3 weeks straight. When I did make it out to social occasions, such as dinner with Nat's lab mates, I often ended up flaking out early, snoozing on their couch with their cat. I wrote in my journal, I feel like I've taken a maternity leave from my life in order to raise this toddler organization into a capable preteen. Query 3, how am I staying open to spirit? When I am in full workaholic mode, I am incredibly focused. I am fixated on achieving my goals, and I leave little space for indecision or extraneous emotion. When I become anxious at the scale of my endeavors, I have strategies for tamping down those feelings, mostly work to the point of exhaustion or binge consumption of TV shows, often while simultaneously working. In this state, it is very difficult to remain open to spirit and to hear leadings. This kind of overextension leading to coping mechanisms that involve that kind of emotional numbing is similar to various kinds of addiction and substance abuse. While I thankfully have not experienced those struggles, I'm not blind to the similarities. After leaving Lead Now at an advanced stage of burnout, it took me months for my normal drive, ambition, and emotions to return. 4 months later, I had been to Ottawa for a political conference and subsequently visited friends in Toronto. Sitting on the tarmac at Pearson Airport, I wrote in my journal, quote, "I can feel my light and life coming back. I have the energy to build new connections, to cook new things, to be generous. This is not to say I don't have down days or less motivated days. But I was afraid my undergrad pace, plus a year as SMU president, plus 2.5 years building Lead Now, had clear-cut my keenness and salted the earth. I am so deeply grateful to feel the joy and excitement and aspirations coming back, and to be based in Vancouver with such rich possibilities around me." Unquote. As I've worked to continue my workaholic rehabilitation, I've been surprised by other things that have come back, some of which I hadn't really experienced since my early teens. In the absence of chronic overwork, exhaustion, and anxiety-numbing behaviors, I am open to spirit in new ways. I feel more feelings. Art touches me in the heart and my soul, when for a long time, art only reached my brain. I cry more easily at world events, which sometimes my ego finds embarrassing, but which I am learning to embrace as a strength of feeling that comes from my core. As I've journeyed into having enough, and as my material circumstances have improved, one of my fears is that I'll get too caught up in the ennui of middle-class concerns and comforts. I worry that having my basic needs easily met and a significant number of family and professional commitments to attend to will keep me distracted from listening for the deeper meaning and leadings in the world. As my heart has opened to feelings I'd long repressed, I find myself embracing a resurgent appreciation for art. There was a time when I felt broken, when I felt I just didn't have feelings the same way others did. Sometimes this felt like a good thing, a triumph of focus and practicality. At other times, it left me impatient, or left out, or awkward. Now, as we are all buffeted by some particularly awful world events in the last year, I am coming to rely on art to call my soul back into feeling, out of the rigor mortis of cynicism, overwhelm, numbness, and the occasional bout of millennial scarcity angst. After the Beirut and Paris attacks last November, it was Somali British poet Warsan Shire that spoke to my condition and led to the writing of my first guest sermon delivered to a United Church congregation. Warsan Shire's words still move me to tears. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world, and whispered, "Where does it hurt?" It answered, "Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere." As the many artists in this room know, art can be the cathartic path to deeper meaning, to a deeper knowing, to the small, quiet voice within, to the quiet, humble leading. This is where I stand. There were times while thinking about this lecture where I was suddenly seized with emotion and the need to write, sometimes most inconveniently, e.g. in the middle of a squished commute on the SkyTrain. One sunny afternoon when inspiration was flowing freely, I wrote, "Writing these thoughts all in a jumble makes me feel alive, like I'm gulping in water after a long thirst." Sociologist Brené Brown opens her book Daring Greatly with this 1910 quote from Theodore Roosevelt. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. The man who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. To me, these words speak to the beautiful feeling when your leading aligns with your humility and your courage to give something your all because you believe it is right. This desire to feel like we are heroically standing up for what we believe in is what makes hero stories so compelling. In the dystopian 2005 film V for Vendetta, the female protagonist, Evie, finds in her cell a letter from a previous prisoner named Valerie, imprisoned for being queer. "I had only told them the truth. Was that so selfish?" she writes. "Our integrity sells for so little, but it is all we really have. It is the very last inch of us, but within that inch, we are free. I shall die here," she continues. "Every last inch of me shall perish, except one. An inch. It's small, and it's fragile, and it's the only thing in the world worth having. We must never lose it, or sell it, or give it away. We must never let them take it from us." Sometimes I experience leadings as beautiful and pristine, like a lake at sunrise. Other times they are raw and gritty, an experience of that last inch inside me. While I first used the term workaholic as a joke, I've come to appreciate the connotations. It holds both the addictive nature of and the lifelong existence of the pattern. I will probably always be a workaholic. I just might be a healthier workaholic who chooses not to overwork and has support systems that help me to stay on a healthier course. I am learning to see the patterns and wave at them like I'm greeting an old friend. This is part of myself that I will journey with until the end of my days. This journey through workaholism doesn't mean that I have no aspirations to future all-consuming campaigns or challenging leadership roles. But it does mean that I have learned a lot about how I act under these conditions and how to keep myself healthy. I will be careful not to tilt at windmills purely for the sake of feeling busy, to save my strength to dare greatly when spirit demands it of me. This brings us to our first stretch break, so I invite you all to stand. Our transformation as a religious society seems an ever-present project, fitting for a faith with continuing revelation at its core. Betty Polster titled her 1988 SPG lecture, "Open to New Light." She wrote, "In 1986 and 1987, we shared the vision of a yearly meeting with greater spiritual depth, with harmony among us in spite of differing outlooks and experiences, of greater witness in word and deed to the community and the world." As I reflect on the transformation we need in 2016, my intention is to speak from my own experience and to not make too many assumptions that friends in the room feel similarly. We are an interesting faith community. At times we are miles ahead of our era, particularly in our social witness. At other times, we are miles behind the modern world, struggling to decide if we want to catch up. Sometimes we acknowledge our foibles like members of a big, extended, sometimes dysfunctional family. Sometimes this acknowledgement comes from a place of love for our little idiosyncrasies, and sometimes it comes with the frustrated feeling that it's all impossible to change. Sometimes we are so clear that we need change. Other times we are stuck, or we need to sit with an issue for years of seasoning. In a faith community that often sees itself as progressive, we sometimes struggle within a process whose default is keeping our current status quo. If we do not find unity in spirit, we make no change. To me, The critical discernment is the wisdom to know the difference between the times we truly need more discernment and when we are simply resisting the discomfort of change, resisting walking into the continuing revelation laid out before us. Tonight, I want to talk about 3 themes that I think would help us strengthen our community. So the first challenge, leaning into the discomfort, talking about money and embracing abundance. You may recall me standing on the floor of CYM 2 years ago, blithely waving monthly donation forms and talking about the importance of being willing to ask for funds. I remain convinced that becoming comfortable talking about money together, or at least becoming comfortable with the discomfort, is a critical muscle to build as we look to stabilize CYM's finances into the future. Yet I have heard so many friends say, "We just don't like talking about money." I've been mulling why we seem to find this so challenging. Is it a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cultural norm around politeness and privacy that nudges fundraising conversations off limits? Is it a fear of judgment of our financial choices or our standard of living? Do we feel that our indulgences that we guiltily think of as unquakerly will be judged? A fear of pressuring people of lesser means? An ickiness of dealing with these worldly concerns when we want to focus our energies on what feel like more spiritually enriching matters? A lack of financial literacy and consequent fear of seeming ignorant? A general anxiety about scarcity? There are many reasons. If it is discomfort with the economic inequalities within our yearly meeting, or a discomfort with the economic privilege many of us experience, failure to engage in the conversation will not make the issue go away. Not talking about our different financial circumstances will not make us more economically equal. Indeed, recent analysis of Britain's Brexit referendum and the rise of Trump in America suggest that learning to talk about economic inequality with honesty and compassion is a critical skill for anyone who wants to avoid the further rise of right-wing nationalist movements. If it's lack of comfort with financial terminology, we need to engage in order to build shared understanding. Knowledge is power, as Francis Bacon supposedly said. If it's a fear of scarcity, we need to look at where we may need to recognize our abundance. It is not in conflict with prudent financial stewardship to approach our resources from a place of joy in the abundance we experience, that we are able to employ staff, fund travel, contribute to causes that bear witness to our concerns, to hold gatherings. We are small and we are geographically dispersed, but we are also a rich community in so many ways. How might we take the next steps together? Second challenge, journeying through conflict. In her SPG lecture, Betty Polster said, "One of the largest obstacles to CYM moving forward towards our vision arises out of a fear of conflict. This is a common fear among friends. We do not want to disturb, we do not want to be difficult, and so we do not share our differences of thought, word, or experience in the open, loving way which would help us all to grow. Instead," Betty wrote, "we remain silent." In my experience, our struggle with conflict continues. As friends, as pacifists, coming to terms with healthy anger can be challenging. I dislike anger as an emotion. While I can call on righteous anger to fuel some of my social witness, I usually find interpersonal anger destabilizing. My instinct is to back away until calm returns. Having internalized at a young age that nobody would take me seriously if I couldn't control my emotions, I have prided myself on my diplomacy under pressure. I speak the language of veiled meaning, and I navigate processes adeptly, and so I am part of Quaker's conflict-avoiding problem. While I'm getting more willing to openly express sadness, fear, and vulnerability, I still struggle with anger. So I think we must ask ourselves again, where are we too polite? Where do we force our concerns into too constrained channels, so that when they eventually burst forth, it is in the form of corrosive frustration, rather than pure cleansing flame? How do we make sure that we distinguish between hurried irritation and deep, seasoned feelings of anger or outrage that deserve to be addressed? Sometimes we seem to think that because Quakers are generally good people, we don't cause harm. Sometimes we think we must be good at conflict because Friends have a rich history of restorative justice work. Sometimes we struggle to resource processes for healing or to design processes that can meet diverse community needs across this unfeasibly large country. Sometimes unspoken hierarchies or particular friends standing in the way cause others to feel unheard. Yet conflicts, especially smaller ones where harm is minimal, may strengthen our spiritual practice. We need to talk more about the evolution of our understanding of gender, sexuality, and consent. Since I was last on this campus 11 years ago, my own understanding of trans rights, consent, and sexual assault have dramatically changed as I have grown up and as the world has changed around me. In an age where our justice system is unable to create justice for women assaulted by Giangomeshi, that sees a privileged Stanford star athlete get a lenient sentence for rape because of the severe impact a harsher sentence would have had on him, or that still raises women to believe that if we are assaulted, it is due to our own promiscuity or to insufficient caution, this conversation needs to be alive in all of us. We need people of all generations to show up for this work. Again, we need to understand that just because we may have good intentions does not mean that we are immune from causing discomfort, exclusion, or harm. Already this week, I've been touched in ways that made me feel uncomfortable, despite no ill intentions. And even in my confident feminism that feels at home and powerful in this community, I chose not to address it. That is a choice that is mine to make, but it's a reminder that we have so much left to do, yes, even among friends. We need to talk more about how we use technology, not whether it is good or bad, but how we use technology in a spirit-led way. Technology provides new tools, and any tool has pros and cons. At its best, Facebook provides a way to keep in touch with friends across the country through photos and real-time interactions. I love seeing Natalie's latest pottery creation, and I love following Rachel Urban Shipley's travels abroad. Social media also allows for citizen journalism, for the live streaming of police brutality, or the sharing of letters from survivors of sexual assault, telling their stories in their own words. But at its worst, Facebook can be an unhealthy addiction that drags you down rabbit holes of envy and insecurity, comparing your own messy life to someone else's beautiful, digitally curated life. We need to talk more about the faithful use of social media and technology, and we need to do it in a way that transcends stereotypical generational attitudes. We need to grapple with intergenerational tensions that affect us all, just like the rest of the world. We need to move beyond the baby boomers versus millennials narrative that keeps getting trotted out by the media. We need to bring together the best each generation has to offer and use those strengths to help each other across generational divides. We need to deepen our practice of worship in meeting for worship with an attention to business. A deeply gathered business meeting is a vector for transformation. We should not sacrifice it in the name of efficiency. We need to continue working towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. While many friends are carrying out this work, as a country, we need every last person to be changed and transformed. And we need to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter is needed here in Canada too, that structural racism is here, north of the border, in our policing practices and in our culture. The work of eradicating racism within ourselves and our society inherently requires deep discernment, and it's unlikely to end in our lifetimes. As the saying goes, you're not learning if you're not uncomfortable. Those of us who are white settler Canadians need to do our own work by engaging other settler Canadians in evolving their understanding and their actions on these issues of racial justice. As we grapple with all of these concerns, our faith holds out to us an abundance of opportunity to keep evolving, to live in our best integrity. We must all meet that call and dare to live into its promise. Community can be blessed and joyful at the same time as it can be struggle and hard work. We are all messy, carrying our own hurts and struggles. We all need to acknowledge when we, personally or collectively, have caused harm, and we need to find better ways to reconcile and heal. We need to bring our emotional skills to the table and be willing to be vulnerable together. As we work to strengthen our collective discernment, to build deeper trust, and develop greater skill in navigating community conflicts, Betty Polster's words from 1988 continue to provide guidance to me. We are often held back along the path to our common vision by our fear of hurt, scorn, or humiliation. We need the loving support of our worshiping community as we reach for new growth in truth, because growth can be a very painful process in itself. We often have to shed old ideas, former certainties, as we move on to new insights. There is sometimes a period of disorientation and grieving before we are ready to acknowledge our new growth. Openness brings risks. We make ourselves vulnerable to the hurts and joys of ourselves and others. We are also vulnerable to the pain which may come when we feel called to follow light shown to us. Without this vulnerability, we cannot be faithful. To be fully human is to be vulnerable, open to pain and joy alike. Challenge 3, healthy boundaries and deeper discernment. Above all, nurturing our blessed community. One of my early notes for this lecture reads, Quaker crankiness, an existential threat? It was a fleeting thought, jotted down on the back of a receipt. But I worry that when friends become too overcommitted, using sometimes unreliable technology to conduct business across our great geographic distances, we can stop working from a place of love and fellowship. As I know from my own experience, failure to set healthy boundaries can lead to reactivity and blind spots. When I am overstretched, I am less effective, less strategic, and less compassionate, and I'm more likely to be snippy or frustrated with my collaborators. When you are busy hammering away, every problem can look like a nail. A couple of years ago, I was clerk of Canadian Young Friends yearly meeting. With my day-to-day full of building Lead Now into a professional organization with staff in 4 time zones, I came to CYFYM full of ideas of deepening our practice of meeting for worship for business and building the strength of CYFYM as an organization. Perhaps we could have a winter retreat in Toronto to do mid-year business. I was sure that we could get all of our reps to CYM committees to report. Perhaps we could have our own clerking and recording workshop tailored specifically to young friends. I am grateful for the gentle questioning of friend Peter Stevenson, who asked if CYFYM really needed to build its own trappings of a yearly meeting. Was that really what would serve our blessed community of young and young adult friends? It was the query I needed to hear, and I've sat with it many times since. There was a time when I would regularly bring my journal to meeting for worship so that I could spend the first 15 to 20 minutes getting everything out of my brain and onto paper, usually a giant to-do list, so that I could let go of it all and truly listen inwardly. There was a time when I had difficulty worshiping because I felt the weight or the guilt of my various Quaker tasks not yet completed. It is difficult to always have the conversation about giving more time or money when so many friends speak of feeling overloaded. So, how would it change the religious society of friends if in our nominations we only said yes to those things we truly felt led to do, from our inner voice rather than from a sense of guilt? What would we have to stop doing? I have a hypothesis. If the spirit of our meeting is healthy and nourished, way will open to tackle the logistical and bureaucratic challenges we face together. But we cannot administer ourselves into spirit. Yes, a well-run society of friends may avoid many stresses, and I believe that for some friends, possibly myself included, work on financials or policy documents or even tax receipts may be spirit-led. But I do not believe that spiritual witness can stem predominantly from these day-to-day and month-to-month doings. Does this mean that the administrative and bureaucratic service of friends should be less valued? Absolutely not. We need to deeply appreciate this work and not fall into societal norms that undervalue work behind the scenes. As a young woman working in operational, financial, and administrative spheres, and with my fair share of administrative Quaker work under my belt, I trust you hear my deep sincerity about that. But those of us who are not serving in these ways, we need you more than ever. We need those who hold wisdom, compassion, deep caring, and grounded weightiness with grace, and those who make fabulous banana loaf and host a great potluck. We need your help. We need you to help our communities be joyous. We need you to host a tea party for all the friends in your meeting who are serving on committees and struggling with overload. Let them come, pour them tea, and hold them in the light as they move their work forward. If you are at a distance, send a kind email, Facebook message, or better yet, send them a whimsical card through the mail. In an era when we spend so much time organizing our lives from in front of our computer screens, the cheerleading of a friendly companion can make all the difference. It helps get good work done in a way we find meaningful, rather than frazzled. There are a million little kindnesses that add up to a beautiful community. We are all responsible for the inward health of our meetings, just as we are all responsible for living our leadings outwardly. I have been blessed to worship in several communities across Canada and to hear about the richness of spiritual community of yet more meetings and worship groups through Rep Meeting and the Canadian Friend. There are so many ways that we build community together. In my home meeting in Victoria, we have Soup and Stories, where friends share stories from their lives over potluck lunch. In Montreal, I attended a midweek worship sharing group. In Halifax, we had spirituality discussion groups after meeting. At Burnaby Worship Group, we have delicious potluck breakfasts, and Vancouver Monthly Meeting has recently started a Why I Am a Quaker series where friends share their spiritual journeys in brief talks after meeting. Of course, community building also happens outside the meeting house and doesn't have to have a spiritual focus. We also gather for knitting, singing, gardening, hiking, board games, and the like to enrich our lives together. I've been blessed in personal relationships with many friends. Just as I would not be who I am today without the community of young and young adult friends I grew up with, I have also been shaped by intergenerational relationships. While too numerous to list exhaustively, I want to tell you briefly about a few of these experiences. I got my first jobs through Victoria friend Janine Gagne, initially helping with first day school and later helping her sell fair trade soccer balls. As a student, I spent a restful weekend at Montreal Quaker Jeff Garver's cabin, canning tomatoes and peaches. When I arrived in Halifax, I was soon invited over for dinner by Kenna Manis. Sipping a glass of wine in her beautiful garden was succor to my soul in a new city. I wouldn't have made it to the wonderful Atlantic Friends gathering had Bruce Deanis not specifically encouraged me to attend. If I hadn't gone, I never would have got to marvel at the brilliance of their all-potluck meal strategy. When stomach flu took out most of our moving crew, several families of friends showed up at 2 hours' notice to help us move into our first Vancouver apartment. Many friends have hosted me or helped me travel from one place to the next. Anne-Marie Ziliakis hosting me in her spare room in Ottawa, Patricia England hosting Nat and me on her farm outside London, Ontario, Dan Cooperstock and Leif Turina and Jana Ryan Smith and Janet Ross in Toronto, Natalie Brunet meeting up for lunch in St. John's, and Kat McQuail driving into Toronto from Guelph to have dinner. Chris Wilson-Yang giving me a ride from Nakanas to Ottawa so I could go and visit Nat when he was in his first year of university. Mylène DePenta driving me up to the Miragamish for AFG. Carol Bradley arranging for us to visit Annapolis Valley friends and somehow attend somebody's wedding reception. The list goes on. I am so, so grateful for this cornucopia of kindness. Psychologist John Gottman has been researching romantic relationships for the past 4 decades, studying thousands of couples. His findings are all about the importance of responding kindly and generously to bids for connection. Here's how the Atlantic writer Emily Esfahani Smith explained Gottman's study. Quote, "Throughout the day, partners would make requests for connection, what Gottman calls bids. For example, say that the husband is a bird enthusiast and notices a goldfinch fly across the yard. He might say to his wife, 'Look at that beautiful bird outside.' He's not just commenting on the bird here. he's requesting a response from his wife, a sign of interest or support, hoping they'll connect, however momentarily, over the bird. Though the bird bid might seem minor and silly, it can actually reveal a lot about the health of the relationship. The husband thought the bird was important enough to bring it up in a conversation, and the question is whether his wife recognizes and respects that. In her 2012 SPG lecture entitled Belonging and the Practice of Our Faith, Dana Mullen spoke of her first time attending a Quaker meeting when she was actively welcomed and engaged in discussion. Quote, "I have often remembered with gratitude the faithfulness of friends present at that long ago meeting in Cambridge. What if some of them had just not bothered to attend that morning? What if the gathering had been restless, the ministry argumentative, the stranger ignored? If only every meeting we hold could be so responsive to the unknown needs of those present with us." Unquote. Sometimes I wonder how much of the work to deepen and expand our community is simply overcoming our own social awkwardness. It has been said that we Quakers are a peculiar people. It takes effort in our society to get down into the meaty, soul-bearing conversations that need to be held with trust and kindness. Sometimes after-meeting chit-chat can be too surface level, similar to the small talk of casual acquaintances at a holiday party. We need more containers to hold deeper conversations that let us bear witness to the ups and downs of each other's lives. It's for this reason that worship sharing is my favorite part of every Quaker gathering. I cherish the opportunity to hear from everyone who wishes to speak, to hear about the transitions and decisions we are all making at different stages of our lives, to understand the inspirations friends draw on in times of struggle. As Brene Brown's research shows, we deepen connection when we are willing to be vulnerable. She writes, "Empathy is about how to communicate that deep love for people in a way so that they know they're not alone." As Betty Polster shared nearly 30 years ago, the courage to openly share and test our discernment deepens both our community and our faith. So let us turn towards each other and see what love can do. This brings us to our second stretch break. Please stand. So, third and final part, transforming our world. This June, I was lucky enough to attend Continuing Revolution, Integrity as a Radical Act, a young adult friend conference hosted at Pendle Hill. Nearly 60 of us, including 5 from Canada, gathered to learn, worship, and discern around the role of integrity in our lives. We asked the question, how do we live with integrity in this time? We are in an age of fearful patterns, bigger than we can fully comprehend. Climate change, economic destabilization, rising inequality, ugly political and structural racism. I now live on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in Vancouver, a city where the real estate market is exploding out of control, where many young people are working precariously, cobbling together bits and pieces of contract work as they strive to pay off their student debt, where decolonization and harm reduction strategies still have so far to go in Canada's poorest postal code, the Downtown East Side, where the Vancouver Foundation recently published that 33% of 20 to 34-year-olds report growing social isolation, that they feel alone more than they would like, feel less welcome in their neighborhood, and are less likely to feel they belong in their neighborhood than any other age group. Gloria Steinem once said, "Feminism has never been about getting a job for one woman. It's about making life more fair for women everywhere. It's not about a piece of the existing pie. It's about baking a new pie." This spring, I saw Gloria Steinem speak at the Broadbent Institute's Progress Summit. Referring to her classic quote, she focused on the rise of austerity and the rise of Donald Trump, saying that the rise of the right requires that society spends more and more time and energy fighting over a smaller and smaller piece of the pie. So authoritarianism and Trumpism rely on scarcity. They rely on people being willing to see the other as a threat. Belief in enough and belief in abundance is in itself an act of faith, an act of resistance. Strengthening an inclusive community actively counteracts these ugly currents. We see a societal thirst for heroes and anti-heroes. My teens started with the Matrix trilogy and wrapped up with V for Vendetta. We have the dystopian Hunger Games about the corruption of power, and the semi-biographical The Long Short about the 2008 financial crash. We have the cynical but addictive TV series that show us some of the worst, some of the most depressing cynicism of humanity. With outstanding production and brilliant acting, we have Mad Men, Game of Thrones, House of Cards to entertain us while sapping our belief in the possibilities of anything but systems and people corrupted and exhausted by power, money, and violence. But what do our stories of heroism tell us? We have our hacker Neo, our compassionate archer rebel Katniss Everdeen, the man in room 5 who goes by V. We have a few larger-than-life David versus Goliath heroes who take on the system, usually with violence, and win. But we have few models for everyday heroism, for the life lived with integrity in the face of systemic challenges. At our best, Quakers have so much balm to offer the modern condition. At our best, we nurture community with the power to be vulnerable together, to bear witness to each other's spiritual condition. We need communities that nurture our spirit in times of sadness and pain, as well as in times of joy. So, what do Friends have to offer an increasingly secular world through our faith and our practice in the year 2016? I have 6 ideas to start with. So firstly, the cultivation of a practice of collective silence and contemplation in an age of distraction. In a city experiencing a housing crisis, silence and space are at a premium. It seems strange to think of silence as a privilege, and yet I see so many of my peers having little silence in their lives. It can be challenging to break patterns of overwork, overbusyness, and anxiety-numbing distractions. A loving community who can offer a gathered silence and who will let you take your time learning how to be with yourself and your inner light in that silence is a beautiful gift. 2, a faith grounded in strong and compelling testimonies that offer up ways to heal the world. Our society tells us to follow status, fame, fortune. Getting and spending we lay waste our powers, as Wordsworth penned in 1806. Dana Mullen said in her 2012 SPG lecture, "Belonging to a meeting is not just a means of satisfying a personal desire to be with others who share a faith. It offers opportunities for testing personal experience against the wisdom and insights of our companions on the journey, past and present." When we choose to walk a different path, joyfully over this earth, to strive to live with integrity and simplicity, creating a more just and sustainable world, we could all use a supportive community of friends to serve as patterns and examples. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. 3, a beloved community in a time of growing social isolation and a fraying social safety net. We all need a community to journey with. In a time of increasing social isolation amongst my generation, with more of us moving around the country for school and work, many of us yearn to be part of intergenerational communities. We need perspective that helps us reshape our aspirations, that reminds us that we are not failures because of financial crises we didn't cause, or because the real estate market has gone bananas. We need elders to sit with us and share their own stories of struggle from when they were our age, so we don't feel so alone. 4, a spiritual practice based in discernment, in questions, rather than dogma. This is critical for many experiencing great existential angst and fear for the future. My early scientific agnosticism was based in a disillusionment and cynicism about organized religion. In the 1990s, the Christian church was in the news for residential school abuses, child molestation, and preaching against abortion and the use of condoms to prevent the spread of AIDS. At 9 or 10, I didn't see how I could trust a religious institution to give me instructions on how to live my life. My generation can be cynical, unwilling to trust governments or banks or other major institutions. Quakers offer values and queries, a spiritual practice that helps us decide how to live, rather than prescriptive answers pronounced from on high. I believe we would be a good spiritual home for many in my generation. 5, interfaith work that transcends the clash of civilizations narrative. Amidst rising secularism, Quakers can play a role in reclaiming a language of faith and spirit that is all too often abused by the most extreme religious voices. In an age of accelerating climate change leading to refugee crises and exacerbated tensions over resources, we need to counteract the clash of civilizations narrative that pits Christian against Muslim, Westerner against the other. We need progressive people who can engage in faith-based conversations and hold spaces for different faiths to come together. And lastly, we have a long tradition of speaking truth to power and engaging in faith-based activism and advocacy. We have the integrity to show up for our own work and a spiritual practice to keep at it, even when it's hard. If we live up to our history, we can live out a model of grounded, principled, nonviolent activism. We can seek to live with deep personal integrity, which enables us to do bold things, including examining the most difficult conflicts within our own souls and within our own communities. We can struggle with the many issues I've raised tonight and keep seeking forward through continual revelation. So with all this to offer, why are we sometimes so hesitant to share our faith, to advertise our meetings, to do anything that might possibly be interpreted as an attempt to proselytize? I believe we need to do more to let our lives speak, to share our light with the world. One of the beautiful things about getting married is that it can bring your whole community together. In the months leading up to our wedding last July, I had many opportunities to explain my faith in general and how Quakers celebrate marriages in particular. This was a little terrifying, sharing a part of myself that I used to keep distinct from my professional and small f friend spheres. I was overwhelmed by how positively my non-Quaker community reacted to the experience of our wedding, and for most of them, their first Quaker meeting for worship. One atheist friend remarked afterwards, "If this is what religion can feel like, I understand why people do this." Another friend loved the phrase, "Let us see what love can do," and now mentions it most times we connect. Still others came away fascinated by ministry about the early equality of women amongst Quakers. And others shared lighter experiences, such as, "I have never been silent for so long," and "I just got the hamster dance stuck in my head." I got to joke that our wedding was my contribution to Quaker outreach efforts for the year. I think back on this experience as being one of such joyful integration in my life. As someone who has braved the world of politics, I know the importance of crafting a message with your audience in mind. But I also know how much my soul seeks the courage to let my life speak, to say, "I am a Quaker, and this is my truth." We can bring the power of personal storytelling and the power of our faith to urge others to action on the major issues of our time. Before I wrap up tonight, I want to share one of the stories I tell. As I mentioned before, a few months ago, I was invited to guest preach at a United Church congregation about climate justice as part of the Fossil Free Faith Network. Speaking after my Muslim Palestinian friend, Misalun al-Ashkar, here's the story and the call to action that I shared. What does it mean to be a person of faith in troubled times? I'm sure I'm not the only one here who asks this, as we've seen record droughts and hurricanes, floods and forest fires across this beautiful land, terror attacks in Beirut and Paris, children killed in Palestine, police murders of people of color based on fear, dehumanization, and racism, as we grapple with how to act on myriad daily injustices. Our faith gives us the moral belief that our actions matter. Our faith gives us a spiritual practice that keeps us from being distracted by the day-to-day, that calls us back to grapple with the troubles of the world and our own responsibilities to act. Our faith gives us the strength to make hard choices, to lead with humility, to live in ways that may be unpopular, uncomfortable, or not in the best interests of our bank balances, because we know in our souls that these are the choices we are called to make. My father's father was the first Quaker in my family, in England. My strongest early memory of my grandfather is of standing together at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. I was perhaps 8 years old. For reasons long forgotten, I asked him if he could sew. He told me yes, he could sew, and that when he was a young man, he had sewn many mailbags while in prison. I was shocked. My grandfather had been to prison? What had he done? He explained to me that during World War II, he had been a conscientious objector, had refused to fight because of the Quaker peace testimony. He was imprisoned and worked on the land, producing food for England. After the war, he worked with war orphans in Germany. In the 1970s and 80s, he led groups of Brits on peace-building trips to the Soviet Union. His faith told him to love all peoples, for there is that of God in everyone. My grandfather was willing to go to jail to stand up for what his soul knew to be right. I was 5 when my parents separated, and 7 when they divorced. My mother, the daughter of 2 World War II British Air Force veterans, was raised in the Anglican and Presbyterian churches in Kitimat, BC. When I was 10, she was a lead organizer to create a union that would give her and her colleagues some job security. I remember overhearing her late at night talking to someone on the phone, trying to talk a woman through her fear of signing a union card, her fear of losing the job her family depended on. I remember hearing the steadiness in my mom's voice and trusting in her courage that we would be okay. She was speaking from one single mom to another, building a union that could bring greater security for both their children. She was willing to take these risks because of her love for justice and her love for me. My mother was willing to risk her job and her home to stand up for what her soul knew to be right. When Quakers worship, we gather in silence, each listening inwardly for the light, the divine. We are seekers, trusting that light will guide us as we discern how to live our lives. If I had been alive during World War II, I don't know for sure if I would have been a conscientious objector like my father's father, or a Morse code operator with the Women's Air Force like my mother's mother. But I know that in this day and age, climate change and all its interlinked injustices are the biggest challenge this world faces. I studied environmental science, policy, and economics to understand what solutions might look like. But that knowledge is not how the change we need will happen. The radical changes we need to meet this moment in history will come from moral courage, from the deep belief and courage and compassion and integrity that can create incredible transformation. The courage to divest from fossil fuels, even if that gives us a sense of financial uncertainty. The compassion to stand against xenophobia and ensure that those most vulnerable are at the forefront of our movements. The integrity to lead with humility, to know that we don't have all the answers, to listen and learn and be open to continuing revelation. To me, climate justice is about respecting the land on which we live, protecting it and its creatures from extreme weather and sea level rise. Climate justice respects the common but differentiated responsibilities of all nations to act, that developed nations must share their fossil-fueled wealth to help developing nations leapfrog to clean technology. Climate justice requires reconciliation with Indigenous communities, recognizing their rights and leadership. Climate justice requires both mitigation and adaptation, and a radical compassion to open our doors to climate refugees. Climate justice needs an economy where no one has to damage the earth to feed their kids. Climate justice is building a world where my children will not go to war over oil and water. It is solar and wind, it is divestment and a price on carbon. It's growing our own food and bicycling. It's joining hands in the street to hold our new government accountable for a fair, ambitious, binding UN climate deal. It's learning to ally with frontline and marginalized communities, and then deepening that learning again and again. And climate justice is so much more than all of this, a deep alignment of justice and love that only poetry, music, and worship can truly express. It is each of us digging deep inside ourselves to do what our souls know to be right. Building climate justice together isn't always easy. Sometimes we are asked to make hard choices, to lead where others' courage has failed them. I come to my faith for courage and wisdom, to discern the ways in which I can and must bear witness to the worries of the world. I think of what my grandfather and my mother were willing to risk because of their beliefs and their love. And usually, I think about how the risks I'm considering are so much less scary. To speak out, to march in the streets, to share a perspective that might make a family friend uncomfortable, to admit when I have been wrong. So I ask you today, what does your faith ask of you? What are you willing to risk to lead towards climate justice? What does your soul know to be true? Let us see what love can do, wrote 17th century Quaker William Penn. Let us lead with our love for this earth and all her peoples. Let us build justice and a safe climate together. So that is the story that I chose to tell that November morning in Knox United Church in Vancouver. I believe that we all have our own powerful stories to tell. So how will you tell yours? Thank you for upholding me and being such generous listeners tonight. I've prepared some queries that I hope may help to continue this thinking throughout this week of our gathering together. I'll make sure these get posted on a wall somewhere, and there will be a SIG, of course, and we'll try to make sure that they get shared electronically for those friends who weren't able to gather here with us today. And because at my core I am a political organizer, I have to close with 3 asks of each of you in this room tonight. Firstly, I ask that you practice explaining your faith and inviting others into it. What is the light that you delight in letting shine? What are you quietly, humbly proud of? Secondly, I ask that you find your way to contribute to community building in your meeting or worship group, to help your community transcend any Quaker crankiness, get better at conflict and money, and turn towards each other's bids for connection. And finally, I ask you to discern what your life would be like if you decided to spaciously, joyously, and abundantly gift some of your time to friends. What Quaker service would you let go? What else in your life would you like to let go? And what new service would you be led to undertake? In loving community, I believe that we can transform ourselves so that we can transform our religious society of friends, so that we can transform the world. Through being open to continuing revelation, way will open, and we will find our way forwards courageously together. Thank you.